Welcome everybody to the Amazon Web Services webinar, Navigating GDPR Compliance on AWS. My name is Christian Hesse. I'm part of the compliance department at Amazon Web Services, and I'm focusing on data protection regulations and of course at the moment especially on GDPR. So in the next half hour to 45 minutes, I will explain a little bit what GDPR is, so what are the main topics around GDPR, and as well how AWS can help you to address requirements of the GDPR. So let's start what GDPR actually is. So the GDPR is short for the General Data Protection Regulations in the European Union, and this is a significant new EU data protection regulation. But actually, it's not that new, but because this regulation is actually a harmonization of standards of the different EU member states. So that means that over the last years, each member state in the European Union had their own regulation, and the GDPR is now a harmonization of those standards. That means that it's actually replacing the local regulations, and the member states have to implement GDPR in their regulation. GDPR is enforceable on May the 25th. So although the law is already around, so you can look into it, of course you can work on it to be compliant, but actually it's only enforceable on the May 25th, and as well it replaces the existing EU Data Protection Directive. So the directive was kind of a framework, so the local member states had their own regulations, and there was this framework on EU level called the EU Data Protection Directive, and this will be then replaced by the GDPR. I think one important topic about the GDPR, especially for all companies or corporations outside the European Union, is the territorial scope. That means it is relevant for all organizations established in the EU, but also for organizations without an EU presence who target to monitor EU individuals. That means monitor EU individuals means that you are actually processing personal data of European individuals. So what is actually GDPR covering? Of course, it is about data, and there are two different categories of data. On the one hand, we have actually the content, and content is anything that a customer or an end user stores or processes using AWS services, including that could be everything: software, data, text, audio, etc. And then we have the personal data, and this personal data is information from which a living individual may be identified or identifiable, and that is actually what GDPR is covering and protecting. So personal data could be, of course, part of customers' content. So that's all around names, email addresses. So actually everything what identifies a person. So what are the main topics, or what is the concept about GDPR? So how is it protecting this personal data? So we have here four main principles. I will explain them a little bit more in detail. So the first one is the right to data portability. And this actually means if you store or process personal data, and the data subject has the right that his data has to be ported, for example, after contract termination. That means the controller, so actually the party who controls the data and as well processes the data, has then the obligation to provide this personal data to the data subject. The second one is the right to be forgotten, or the right of deletion. And this gives individuals the right to have certain personal data deleted, so third parties can no longer trace them. So that means, for example, again, if a if a contract terminates, there is this obligation then for the controller to delete data, or if the data subject is getting in contact with the data controller, the data controller then has to delete this personal data. Another concept is the privacy by design. I think it's a very important one. The privacy by design helps to facilitate the inclusion of policies, guidelines, and work instructions related to data protection in the earliest stages of projects, including personal data. So that means if you start a project, a new application, a new process, whatever, you always should have data protection, so the protection of personal data in mind. So for example, the right to be forgotten. So if you create or develop a new application, make sure that this application from the beginning has some functionalities to delete personal data. And the last one in this regard is a data breach notification, also a quite important one. And controllers must report personal data breaches to the relevant supervisory authority within 72 hours. So that's very important. So the relevant supervisory authority is usually that supervisory where you, for example, subsidiary or your main subsidiary or your headquarter in the European Union is located. And after you get aware of any data breach, you have 72 hours to report this to the authorities. And if there is a high risk to the rights and freedoms of a data subject, you also have to notify the data subject. So the person, for example, who's providing the personal data. So I mentioned a lot of expressions like data subjects, like data controllers, as well processor. So who is who now in this whole concept? So the data subjects, they are actually, for example, persons who are providing their personal data to a data controller. The data controller is then really the person or the corporation who is controlling and managing data. There are specific obligations to the data controller, and that data controller may use a so-called processor. For example, AWS. So for example, if you are running an application or a database on top of AWS, and collecting end user data. So the end user data would be the data of the data subjects. You would be the data controller, and AWS would be the processor. And both controllers and processors have obligations under GDPR. There might also be another scenario, so we're expanding the one I explained before, so that we again have the data subjects. But for example, there's a SaaS application. Yeah, so that means this SaaS application is running on AWS. AWS is again the processor. The SaaS provider or vendor is also the processor, because the data uploaded or stored in the SaaS application is actually not managed by the SaaS provider, but maybe a company who's using the SaaS application. And in this case, the company is then the controller of the personal data of data subjects. And again, of course, the controller and the processor have obligations under GDPR. So the controller may be the company who's using the SaaS application, then the SaaS provider as a processor, and as well AWS as another processor. So what I explained a little bit some concepts. Very important about GDPR is, of course, the technical and organizational protection of this personal data. They are called technical and organizational measures, or short TOMs, and there are basically 4 areas. So the first area is the pseudonymization and encryption of personal data. So this is in the law that controllers should try to either pseudonymize data or encrypt data. And the second one is to ensure the ongoing confidentiality, integrity, availability, and resilience of processing systems and services. So that means you have to make sure that the applications, the data center, everything is secure and is protecting this personal data. The third one is the ability to restore availability and access to personal data in a timely manner in the event of a physical or technical incident. So that means if your application is breaking down or the data center is breaking down, that you have either architected the application in that way that you can either restore or bring up the application in a very short time, or for example that if there's something wrong with the physical infrastructure, that you have redundant systems, that the data center are backed up, etc. And as well as a fourth point, the process for regularly testing, assessing, and evaluating the effectiveness of the TOMs. So, of course, on the one hand, that means it makes sense to have some kind of certification or attestation of the other 3 points, and as well that there are processes in place which test the effectiveness of these technical and organizational measures. So what is AWS providing in this regards? Of course, we are providing tools and services. I will explain a little bit. We, on our side, also implemented a strong compliance framework. We offer a partner network which can help in regards to the GDPR. And of course, we are addressing the obligations to us as a processor in data protection terms. So maybe you know this shared responsibility model, which actually explains which party is responsible for what area. Amazon Web Services is responsible for the security of the cloud, and the customer is responsible for their security compliance in the cloud. So we are responsible, of course, making sure that the data centers are secure, basically the whole physical infrastructure, the networking, the compute storage databases, etc. But then the actual implementation of security features in this area is then the obligation of the customer. So if we map this shared responsibility to GDPR, we also have several areas, and we will look into what area the controller is responsible, or the processor. So in general, the legal compliance lies with both, so the controller and the processor. That's the reason why AWS is offering either a data processing agreement, which is addressing these legal requirements, or updating their services terms with clauses addressing GDPR. The second area is the system security and data protection by design. Again, of course, it's a responsibility of both the controller and the processor. As I explained, so AWS makes sure that their area they are responsible for is secure, and as well the controller has to do the same, especially for the area the controller is responsible. There are many tools I will explain a little bit later which could help there. The recording of processing activities is again the responsibility of both the controller and the processor. So you have to make sure that you have some kind of monitoring and logging mechanism in place, which is actually monitoring the processing activities. So who, for example, who has access to certain personal data, who deleted personal data, or in general if personal data has been deleted, etc. Again, there's tooling available by AWS. The fourth one, I think it is a very important security measure, is the encryption. This again is the responsibility of both the controller and the processor. of course, AWS makes sure that certain areas are encrypted where personal data, but as well customer content is involved, and we are also providing tooling which helps the customer or the controller to implement encryption. The management of data subject consent, so that means that's basically the legal relationship between the controller and the data subject is the responsibility of the controller. So that means the controller have to define the scope and the subject of the processing, and have to provide this information to the data subject, and have to get some kind of consent or contract or whatever. The management of personal data deletion is again obligation of both the controller and the processor. Of course, mainly the controller, because they are actually managing the data. But of course, the processor has to make sure, if the controller is deleting data, that this deletion actually happens in the processor's systems and services. The management of personal data portability is the controller responsibility. I explained it at the beginning that a data subject has the right to ask for his data, for example, at the end of a contract, and in general, the responsibility to return the data is the obligation of the data controller. Again, AWS is providing interfaces, APIs, etc., to help to retrieve all this data. And as well, in general, the security of personal data is the obligation of the controller. But of course, I mean, the controller, the controller needs help, especially in the case if the application or the system is running on a cloud platform as AWS, there has to be support from the processor, but the obligation, the requirement is with the controller. So here's an overview about services we are offering. I already mentioned that when I did the mapping. So we have the whole data protection by design and by default. So there are many AWS services which can help there. So for example, using Amazon Snowball from think about from the beginning using something like this for the data portability, the API gateway, as well as a tool to retrieve data, virtual private cloud VPCs, of course, to protect personal data, as well identity and access management, Active Directory integration, which controls access to personal data, as well the implementation of a SAML federation. Security of processing using encryption with KMS, key management systems, or Cloud HSM, and as well server-side encryption, for example, in EBS. The records of processing activities, you could use the AWS Service Catalog, CloudTrail, and AWS Config. I will come to this in the next slides. So they are, so I explained a little bit about major requirements of GDPR. There are some more, I already mentioned them, but I will mention them now again, and as well do some kind of mapping what AWS services and tools could help here. So one important one, and this is actually also mentioned in the regulation, is data access control. So that means the controller shall implement appropriate technical and organizational measures for ensuring that by default only personal data which are necessary for each specific purpose of the processing are processed. So that means you have to make sure that only authorized people and persons, or as well applications, are able to access the personal data, and have to prevent any unauthorized access to this data, and of course you need to know who is accessing data in this regards. There are, for example, I'm not showing all the tools we have in this area, but I think one very important one is the identity and access management tool, which is the basis to configure all the access to your environment, to your VPC, but as well you can use it and implement it into your application. So I think this is a very powerful and strong tool and service which helps especially to address this requirement by the GDPR. This is for just an example that, of course, the identity and access management also provides features like geo-restrictions, so that you say, okay, for example, I only want access from a certain area of the world, and then you can configure this here, and this is also somehow addressing the data access control. Another very important area of GDPR is the monitoring of access activities. Also, this is explicitly mentioned in the regulation. So each controller and where applicable, the controller's representative shall maintain a record of processing activities under its responsibilities. So as I explained, you should monitor who has access to the personal data, and of course maintain a record of that. As well, I think we have a very powerful tool in this regard. It's called CloudTrail. CloudTrail, you simply turn it on and define the services which should be logged, and then actually CloudTrail is logging all API calls, and then you have different you can choose how to process this CloudTrail log. So you either can store it in a S3 bucket and do your own archive and auditing, or you can use it right away for troubleshooting, or for example you use Amazon CloudWatch and then define monitors, alarms, and etc. So this is then really helping you to monitor, for example, access, authorized, unauthorized access, and for example, in the case of unauthorized access, that alarm or anything is then coming up and is informing you that there might be something wrong with the access. As well, we have a tool which is fairly new. I think it started mid of last year. It's called Amazon Guard Duty. Again, this is also a tool which can be turned on for your environment, and then actually it's a automated monitoring tool for security incidents. So it actually analyzes CloudTrail events, VPC flow logs, DNS logs, etc. And if there is a threat, for example, there's also an alarm, or of course you can define actions that are taking when certain things are coming up or are happening. Another area, I also mentioned that before, it's also explicitly mentioned in the GDPR. It's not a hard requirement, so the regulation does not say you have to encrypt data, but I think it definitely makes sense to encrypt data and use data encryption as one of the major security measures to protect personal data. So the regulation actually says that organization must implement appropriate technical and organizational measures to ensure a level of security appropriate to the risk, including pseudonymization and encryption of personal data. AWS is also offering vast selection of encryption functionality. I think one of the major ones is KMS, so the Key Management Service. which is creating and then providing keys, encryption keys for your environment. So you can either use it and, for example, to encrypt your S3 bucket, but you also could use the service to implement encryption in your application or in your database or whatever. As well, in regards to encryption, there's also a service called Cloud HSM, which is then providing HSM capabilities to our customers, and this gives you the capability to manage keys. So these are two encryption services, which, as I said, could be either implemented into our AWS service, S3 or RDS or any other service, or into your application you're running on top of AWS. The last one, the strong compliance framework, I think also a quite important one, because first of all, of course, you have to test and make sure that the security, the technical and the organizational measures are effective and adequate. So that's the first thing, and as well somehow you also have to prove this to your customers or to the data subjects then. And I think certifications and strong compliance frameworks will help here definitely. So again, if we look into our shared responsibility model, we have AWS with a variety of certifications for data protection, and especially here the technical organizational measures. The ISO certifications are very often used. So for example, the ISO 27001, the 27017 for security in the cloud, and I think also quite important, the 27018, which is then actually controls around protection of personal data. So all these certifications are in place at AWS. And there's another one which is German specific, but also well known in other European countries. It's called the C5 attestation, and this is also focusing on security in the cloud. So this is what we are providing as a processor, and how we are showing that we and how effective we implemented technical and organizational measures as well as security measures. And of course, on the controller side, it might make sense to also have that kind of certification, but maybe also other ones. So maybe also ISO certification for the environment you are running on top of AWS. So that, as I said, that could be our ISO. As I said, this is well known in regards to data protection, but there are also others like SOC or the so-called GDPR Code of Conduct. I will explain in the next slide. So the GDPR Codes of Conduct, I'm always, or I often got the questions, what certification or what attestation is addressing GDPR? So I need something like the ISO or the SOC or whatever. Actually, so far, there was no certification which was approved by the authorities or provided by the authorities, and if you get this certification, you're then actually GDPR compliant. But GDPR has now the concept of the so-called codes of conduct. This is starting with Article 40, 41, 42, and so on. And this is actually going in this direction. So the code of conduct should be that kind of certification, and they should be actually frameworks which contain the legal obligations of a data controller or as well a data processor, as well as the technical and organizational measures. And those code of conducts, actually they look a little bit like data processing agreements, plus the description of the technical and organizational measures. And the idea is that those code of conducts are approved by the authorities. And then if a company or a corporation is adhering to this code of conduct and is implementing actually what it's written in this code of conduct, so as well from the legal side, as well from the technical and organizational measures side, they can use then this code of conduct and show to their customers that it's actually GDPR compliant. But of course, this only works if this code of conduct is then approved by the authorities. The authorities for the GDPR will be the European Data Protection Board. At the moment, it's the Article 29 Working Party. But from 25th of May on, it will be the European Data Protection Board. AWS is part of the so-called CISPE Code of Conduct. The CISPE Code of Conduct is a joint effort of cloud infrastructure providers, and they came up with this kind of code of conduct. This code of conduct has already been submitted to the Article 29 Working Party. CISPE already got a feedback and from the authorities, and now CISPE is working to include the feedback from the authorities, and is then resubmitting the code of conduct, and of course is looking for approval hopefully this year. And then this is a sign, if the code of conduct is approved, this is a sign for corporations and customers that this cloud provider is compliant to GDPR. AWS, of course, is not only providing tools and services, and they are not only as well a code of conduct, but we also have a lot of partners on our AWS marketplace, which provides services and toolings which help to address the GDPR. So in the area of advanced threat analytics, application security, identity and access management, server endpoint protection, network security, encryption, key management, as well as vulnerability and pen testing. So all these partners help to address requirements like data access control, monitoring of data processing, encryption, so implement adequate security measures to protect personal data. They all help you to address the requirements of GDPR. And there are also AWS partner who help you in the area of projects. So if you're starting a GDPR project, and of course this not only contains implementing technical measures, but also there is a portion in the legal space which have to be addressed and have to be evaluated. And we have partners in Europe, for example, of like Deloitte, like Soprasteria, like the Direktgruppe in Germany. So they can help you in all these areas on the legal side, and as well in the technical space. But of course there are many more, and I think there are also partners around the globe which can help in those regards. And again, there are also technology partners which can help them, especially in the area of technical and organizational measures. AWS also has an offering in regards to the GDPR from our ProServe team. So they are supporting with technical solutions, especially in the area of privacy by design. So if you're planning to either make your application or your system GDPR ready, or you want to deploy a new application, and you're planning to process personal data of people residing in the European Union, then ProSafe will help you with implementing privacy by design. So what functionalities, what services, what features should be implemented from the beginning, and then again, this is helping you in the future if you're updating the application, or as well if you're planning to come up with a new application or with a new system. So AWS is also providing more information on its website. So it's the GDPR Center, and you can find there, for example, a white paper on navigating GDPR compliance and on AWS. This white paper goes a little bit more in detail, especially on the technical side, and what tools and functionalities could help with addressing the GDPR. You also could find FAQs on the most common questions on GDPR, and I hope that will help you as well to navigate GDPR. I hope that was a informative and as well a helpful webinar on GDPR. I think you can also ask questions now in this webinar, and we will then try to answer all your questions directly. Thank you very much.